listening is a way of doing beauty. We all, in the 21st century, are born almost by default into this kind of multi-perspectival approach. The motivation here is so that we can feel that we have more clarity and that we are seeing the truth of a matter more clearly, because ultimately, the more we do that, the less inclined we will be to destroy and judge and just create ugliness in the world.
Welcome to the podcast. It is, as ever, wonderful to be with you today and share this exploration through the pathways of co-creating a beautiful future. It's such a joy to share this space with you. We are still wanting to hear from more of you through our questionnaire on how we can go about creating a community space for you online. As this is something we will invest time and money and resources into, we want to know that you really want it. And of course, there are many different options, so it's great for us to understand how it could best serve your needs and be a space that really adds value to your life and to our possibilities of a beautiful future. So please do spend 5 minutes to share your thoughts there. You can find it if you go to the top of the community page on our website. So you go to www.thefutureisbeautiful.co and click on community and support, and you'll also find it in our weekly newsletters at the moment. And for those of you that identify as being a woman, I am hosting a summit over Diwali weekend, which is our festival of lights and a perfect time to shine. It's called Style and Presence, a reclamation of worth. It is offered in the gift, meaning that it's free, and will take place over 4 days and has 52 potent women sharing in the sessions, including my guest today. It's something that is very meaningful for me and has been in the making for a number of years. You can find the link and register over on the events page at www.amisha.co.uk or go straight to styleandpresence.com. Style and Presence invites us to join together for a potent celebration and exploration into our self-worth as women, or those that identify as women, and how this relates to the worth of the world. As we stand here in 2020 with everything that has come to the surface, we see we are living in a world of distortion and destruction, and at the same time, beauty and possibility. The systems of patriarchy, colonization, and neoliberalism have culminated in our worth being for sale in blatant and subtle ways. White women paying to tan, brown women bleaching their skin light, people dying to make clothes that are worn once. The list goes on and on. These insecurities feed a whole system of modern-day slavery, toxic chemical dumping, and landfill waste as we struggle to keep up the pressures and wear our perfect masks. All this energy on the exterior can take precious time away from the inner healing and the real transformative work these times are calling forth in us. There is another path, the way of the empowered woman who is co-creating a beautiful future. This summit wakes us up to our knowledge and embodiment that we are worth more than this cycle of fear, greed, and exploitation, reminding us how to move away from this toxic culture into one of cultivating both style and presence. True style comes from the heart. It's knowing who we are and what is important to us. It's responding to the times we live in, an ecological and human rights crisis, and with compassion expressing our creativity through how we show up in the world. Presence is being in authenticity with this, so we can radiate our truth in whatever situation we are in. We become somebody that turns heads when we walk into a room because we are in alignment with ourselves and our feminine power. This is about more than what we wear, but who we are, coming into our wholeness and reclaiming all the parts of ourselves that we may have cast out or never before discovered within. We cultivate our style and presence by deepening our true self-worth and understanding our relationship with what we are here to contribute to the worth of the world. From this place, we can open up new pathways to healing, joy, and activism that mirror our own sense of love and worth with our relationship to each other and the earth. Style and presence invites us into this deeper dance with all of life. Style and presence is our reclamation of worth. And so all of you that identify as a woman are welcomed into this gathering. But I'm really looking forward to this celebration and inquiry and empowerment that will come through this time. My guest this week is Minna Salami, and she is a Nigerian, Finnish, and Swedish author, blogger, feminist theorist, and lecturer. Her multiple award-winning blog, MsAfropolitan, connects feminism with critical reflections on contemporary culture from an Africa-centered perspective. As a lecturer and keynote speaker, she has spoken at over 200 universities, cultural events, and conferences on 5 continents. She is the author of Sensuous Knowledge, a Black Feminist Approach for Everyone, which is a series of thought-provoking essays exploring universal concepts such as art, beauty, identity, blackness, and womanhood, with an Africa-centered, decolonial, and feminist paradigm of knowing. Minna is a co-director of the feminist movement, Activate, and she sits on the advisory board of the African Feminist Initiative at the Pennsylvania State University, and the editorial board of the Interdisciplinary Journal for the Study of the Sahel. This podcast episode is part of a series of 8 conversations called Listening to Each Other, Listening to Earth. This series is a collaboration with St. Ethelberga's Centre for Reconciliation and Peace in London, and funded by the Calliopeia Foundation. Calliopeia was founded as an independent foundation to help support people and organizations who are working to bring spiritual values into institutions and systems of everyday life and work. The name Calliopeia means beautiful voice and refers to the first of the 9 Greek muses. She is associated with heroic poetry, justice, and transforming lower qualities into higher. St. Ethelberga's builds community resilience for times of ecological and social emergency through practical collaborative action. They aspire to courageously face the realities of the landscape we are in, whilst also holding a vision for regeneration, for a just and inclusive world, rooted in care for each other and our common home. Their work is organized around 4 principles, which are: put values into action, seek opportunity in crisis, build community across differences, and protect what is sacred. Listening to Each Other, Listening to Earth reaches for the place where spiritual ecology and climate justice meet. It explores the integration of spirituality with grounded action through the lives and leadership of people of color. In this conversation, called The Language of Our Rivers, we explore the themes of sensuous knowledge, beauty, and integrity as we contemplate the question, can the powers of our flowing minds expand our language of reciprocity? We hope that you enjoy this conversation and that it opens up that flowing river of your own possibility within. Welcome to The Future is Beautiful, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between politics, spirituality, creativity, and sustainability. It's time for us to move beyond silos and into an integrated way of being. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a brighter future. This is the revolution. Despite the challenges we face as a global community or the pressures that we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to dream, to ask ourselves the big questions, and to share what we are already doing, we create the future that we wish to wake up for. That future is beautiful. Minna, it is an absolute delight to welcome you to The Future is Beautiful, especially as I have, from a distance, seen your work for a decade or so. It's really wonderful to get to speak with you today.
Thank you, Amisha. I'm also really pleased to be here. And, it's quite funny and interesting how we have known about each other's work for a decade, as you said, and through a kind of alternative means now been brought together in this format to share. I'm really looking forward to it.
For this episode, as this is part of our series, Listening to Each Other, Listening to Earth, I wondered if you could share what that means to you and how it shows up in your own life.
So the first word that comes to mind for me when I think about listening to each other is presence. The same word is also what it means to listen to Earth. And I guess speaking to your last point, what it means to listen to oneself. It might seem quite an obvious and sort of evident term when it comes to listening, or it should be, but it quite often isn't. And especially in our time when we are distracted by so very many things, from new technologies and social media to busy lives and to sort of juggling everything, relationship, the personal and the political, to then show up and be present when we are in commune with others. And similarly, when we spend time with nature, it is essential to be present. And by that, I mean to be curious, to be attentive, and to really sort of decenter the ego and decenter the self and be receptive to what the other, once again, be it a other in the shape of a human being or the shape of a tree or the shape of the stars or the shape of sitting down in meditation. To listen is something that I would say we think we know how to listen. It's one of the, hearing is obviously one of the senses, and we hear things all the time, but there's a vast difference between hearing and listening. And listening it's almost an art form of sorts. It isn't something that is automatic to us. So when we think of it that way, we realize that, just as you can't paint like Wangechi Mutu or Van Gogh or, whomever reference the listener is familiar with of a great artist, the same thing goes for listening. Like, we can't just listen by default. It's an art form. It's something that we need to practice, and especially important to cultivate and to practice in times when we're so polarized and we really struggle with understanding the other. We exist in these bubbles where we're very judgmental and condemning of political views, of ideological views, of the lifestyle choices that others make. And again, here, I think, we have so much to learn from listening and being present to nature because of the way that the natural world coexists, how it can teach us that we are all in this kind of ecosystem of togetherness. And we have to figure out ways in which we can accept that we're all different, but we can still discover ways in which our differences can actually enrich rather than impoverish our culture and our society and our personal lives. I find presence also to be a key word when it comes to listening, because it's the way that we see beauty. Beauty is something that we almost have to seek out. And, again, we live in this world system where we are told what things are, and we're discouraged from exploring them by ourselves and defining for ourselves what we feel about a concept like beauty, say. We have this very rigid idea of what beauty means, but perhaps defining beauty is perhaps one of the most important things we can do in our lives, defining beauty for ourselves. Toni Morrison says, I think it is in The Bluest Eye, there's a short passage where she's addressing the question of beauty, and she uses it as a verb. She urges, one of the characters urges another one of the characters to do beauty. Listening is a way of doing beauty and becoming present to the little things that people around us might say, their gestures. We know from our most intimate and beloved relationships that the things that make a person beautiful are usually the things that are really idiosyncratic to them, very specific to them, the way that, or maybe the way that they do things that are actually unexpected of them. So somebody who's not very emotional and who's close to you suddenly showering you with affection. Those are the kinds of things that we tend to find really beautiful and really touching. And similarly, those aberrations in nature, because again, like even with nature, we have this set idea that we're educated from a really young age to think of, some kind of idyllic scenery as the epitome of natural beauty. And of course, quite often a meadow in springtime is going to be breathtakingly stunning. But when you become present and when you listen to the language, the poetry of the natural world, sometimes you're just struck by the beauty of a molding branch or a quarrel between two squirrels or whatever it might be. And it's such, I think that is what Morrison meant when she said do beauty, because the more we're present, the more we hear and see those little gestures, the more sort of enriched our personal internal and inward spaces become, and the more enriched those spaces become, the better our communing and being together will be, because we are then sort of collectively doing beauty, which isn't about everybody agreeing again. And that is the beauty of listening, is that you recognize that it is precisely those places where we differ, where we bring our own very unique personalities into a shared space that enriches.
Yeah, so potent, this power of doing beauty. And for me, it's also the embodying of beauty, the being of beauty, but not in the external validated way that the dominant culture suggests, but in that way of when we are embodying that true understanding of beauty, that we have that reciprocal relationship of beauty. We're just creating more of it in relationship with everything that we come into contact with.
Yes, absolutely. It's almost like a drug or a virus, but in the most positive sense that we could use that word in these times. But it's something that when one person latches onto it, then it spreads to the next, and so on and so forth. And I also really appreciate your use of the word embodiment in this context. It made me think of how, if I'm not mistaken here, but the prefix em means to insert something, and ment means the mind. So when you go to the etymological roots of the em and the ment in Latin, and so embodiment is to insert something into the mind. So when you say to embody beauty or the embodiment of beauty, it's really, it isn't about the external. It is about what you insert into your mind. And of course, that can then reflect externally in the shine of your smile and your body language and how warm you are toward other people, or how you resist and how you stand up for your own values, which are also qualities that are extremely beautiful to watch a person do.
Absolutely. Because in an understanding of the mind that is more expansive, and with the research that we now have, of the heart intelligence, the gut intelligence, the cellular intelligence, the way that all of that information is connected, and often this thing that we think of as the mind, like, is not just in the mind. It's such a tiny part of the way that our brain works. And so I often talk about embodying our values, and how our values, our integrity can be part of everything that we do and we say, and the ways in which we show up and relate.
It's such a difficult thing to do. It's perhaps one of the most difficult things for a person to do, to live with integrity. Yet, precisely because it is such a challenge, it is perhaps the most meaningful thing to endeavor to do. I've always found that that's like a worthy life purpose to have. Yeah, like I can get really almost feel claustrophobic if I don't act in a way that represents my values. It's it's something that is really important to me, and maybe that's why I've also appreciated throughout the course of my journey in life something very difficult at times. It's not always easy to do, and so I urge people to really sit with what it means to live with integrity, and maybe even just 5% more than we do at the moment. Not to put a number on it, but but because it can be daunting when you think about, like most of us, and obviously most people listening to this podcast, care and love our earth, Mother Nature, and want to protect it. And yet perhaps, we order things on Amazon or whatever it might be that we feel guilty about. And sometimes if we just think, okay, I'll just do 5% less of that, and maybe add that 5% to like petitioning my local mayor or a company or whatever it might be, or creating a blog. Yeah, I think if we can all just slightly increase the volume on our integrity, it could lead into a ripple of change. And yet at the same time, I'm aware that when you speak of integrity, it's easy to sound like you're speaking from some high horse. That's why I wanted to preface by saying how incredibly difficult it is.
Yeah, you have to have a playful attitude to life when you aspire to live from integrity, when you have that sense of when things are in and out of alignment, and when you feel like how you want to show up, and yet you find yourself showing up a different way because of systems of oppression, conditioning, ancestral trauma, and so on and so on and so on. And so it has to be something that isn't ranked for yourself or like with others, but it is a kind of remembrance, right? That we can keep going even when we fall off the horse.
Yeah. And also I think that this is where the political and the personal really merge, because, there's just, I think in our times, the understanding of spirituality is really quite detached from society. There's still this flavor to the notion of being a spiritual person, of being somebody who can distance themselves from what is going on in the world, what is going on in our societies and in our personal lives. And when you really think about it, to be a spiritual person, which I think is, you can live with integrity and not at all ever refer to yourself as spiritual. But when I say spiritual, I mean the sort of interior life. There's a link there between spirituality and living with integrity. No matter how enlightened you may become in your own space, and how many chakras you open when you're meditating or whatever it might be, to be able to really clearly hear and feel and identify the things that are happening around you and how they ultimately impact yourself as well, is part of that journey. I thought about that quite a lot during like the Black Lives Matter protests earlier this year, and how there was just this missing angle among many people who are otherwise really enlightened and aware of how, if you have a police system, which we have, all across the world, not only in the US, although they have weapons there, so it makes it more pertinent. But if you have a policing system that treats one group in society so unjustly, then how can you yourself feel safe in being protected by that system? Like, even if they don't directly harass you or people like you, it's a kind of corrupt system that is leading the way. In terms of being able to listen and being able to spread beauty and integrity and all of that, the more you delve into those questions, the clearer it becomes that we have to go to the root of the issue. And for me, that root is the very way of knowing, the knowledge production in our societies. And as you spoke about, like how it creates these system of hierarchies and ranking, and we embody those things ourselves, and we begin to rank our own behavior and become really self-critical. And so we see the kind of corrupted conventional way of thinking and the educational system that we're all indoctrinated with impacting us deeply personally in how we, in all of the negative self-talk, and then how we then impose that upon others in our little bubbles. We do exactly the same thing. So the way that we might say to ourselves, oh, you're not good enough, you don't know enough about this topic to talk about it with others. We appropriate the same thing upon a whole group of people when they are expressing their views and say, oh, you're not good enough, you're not allowed to think that way. And fundamentally, this is the way that we've been taught to think, in fragmented and divisive ways. I think the big challenge is really changing how we see the world, shifting our worldviews and our narratives and our perspectives.
You write in your book about political beauty. Can you share a little bit about what that means and how you understand that?
The key aim in the book is to provide a counter narrative, which I call sensuous knowledge. It's a counter narrative to what I call Euro-patriarchal knowledge, which isn't synonymous with white men, but rather this way of thinking that is really fragmenting, that I just spoke about. And in contrast, sensuous knowledge is about synthesizing science and art and storytelling and academic study, emotional intelligence with reasoning, and so on. And so I develop sensuous knowledge, and then I apply it to universal concepts like beauty, but also power and identity and womanhood, to explore what those concepts could look like when we think of them more holistically. In the chapter, which is about beauty, I was interested to explore, beauty from a different perspective with the sensibility of sensuous knowledge. And so I identified that there are 3 types of beauty, and one of them is political beauty. And the second and third are artificial beauty and genuine beauty, respectively. Political beauty is beauty that has an agenda. In the book, I trace it back to kind of biblical myths about Adam and Eve and how those have been supported over the centuries by political agendas that work against women, that work against people of color, that work for capitalist endeavors, and that work against the non-human natural world, and so on. We're being taught that something is beautiful in order to perpetuate a political agenda, a political story. For example, if we're taught that female beauty looks a certain way, you're supposed to have an hourglass figure or fair skin or whatever it might be. The list is so long of the different ways that we're told that this is what it is to be a beautiful woman. But it is beyond that. It is the political message is that women are to fulfill and to be preoccupied with an aesthetic, a very particular type of aesthetic, and that in return then prevents us from being fulfilled and preoccupied with other endeavors in life, and perhaps most essentially the endeavor of self-realization and complete independence and adulthood and responsibility, and things that are ultimately really important also in any kind of spiritual quest. Artificial beauty is beauty that has a capitalist agenda. The marketable side of political beauty, it helps to sell political beauty. So it's anything that is really glittery and shiny. It's those kinds of, glossy images of what beauty should be.
And all the industries that come along with them, with that.
Yeah, exactly. So the way that I describe it is like if beauty were a garden, then political beauty would be a garden where all of the pots look exactly the same and it's like all very rigid. Because one of the key elements of political beauty, and that I explore in depth in the book, is how Euro-patriarchal knowledge has always sought to measure and classify beauty. There's all kinds of attempts like from the golden ratio to the beauty line by William Hogarth. There's lots of examples of, white men really trying to measure and mechanize beauty. So the political beauty garden would be really machine-like. And the garden of beauty, if it were for artificial beauty, it would look amazing. So you would walk into the garden and you'd see all these ponds and fountains and colorful birds and all kinds of flowers. But the moment you try to touch them or smell them, you would realize that there's nothing there, it would disappear. Whereas genuine beauty, which is this thing of doing beauty and listening and seeing with your third eye almost, it's the beauty that is everlasting. And so that garden would just be quite wild or mellow or whatever it would be. It would just feel really like a serene space, and a space that is anachronistic in that that this is something that existed for our ancestors millennia ago and will hopefully, God's willing, exist in another 1,000 years still for others.
From this perspective of sensuous knowledge, how can we understand our relationship with nature, with Earth, with the more than human world?
Nature is really at the center of sensuous knowledge in so many ways, because I refer to it as a mind, body, and soul approach, if you like. And even though it has to do with the senses, sensuality is only about the senses, about seeing and hearing and tasting and touching. But sensuousness transcends that. So it's when you involve the senses, you involve the intellect, you involve the body. So it's really holistic. The way that we come to involve ourselves in this holistic way, it is just quintessential that the natural world plays a part in that. Because our first memories, our first experiences of sight, smell, touch, and so many of our experiences as children, when we trace back, are set in nature. We develop language by observing nature. We also develop theory. It's really interesting when you listen to children when they encounter animals or trees or oceans, whatever it might be, and the way that they describe what they're seeing and what they're feeling and perceiving is theory. They're theorizing. Oh, this is how it feels when I take a bath, they might say, when they're in a river swimming. And that's what sensuous knowledge is about, because Europatriarchal knowledge has made us very robotic, because at its core, it is always about fragmenting and binaries. So, men versus women, black, white, this, that, the mind and the spirit. And when we bring everything back together, we start to theorize in our own way, in our own language. We bring an embodied sense of self into the world. So in the writing of the book, I spent a lot of time outdoors in nature, watching all the footage about especially rivers, because I developed a theory in the book that I call exusions, which is a theory about power. And it's a theory that is based upon the language of rivers in the book specifically, but actually it extends to all of nature and sort of patterns that I found in nature and also that exist within the human body. So these kinds of branching dendritic patterns. It felt very seminal to speak with nature and to listen. I guess the question that I posed in my mind is, what can a river teach me about power? And once I had asked that question, it is that childlike way of theorizing. You kind of work yourself up into a mode where you ask something that you wouldn't normally, or that may be evident, but, it becomes a journey for you. So once I had asked that question, I couldn't let go of it. I obsessed about what rivers could teach me about power, and, read a lot about rivers, and I was traveling a lot for work. So wherever I went, I would find out if there was a river nearby, and I would go there and just be near the river and listen to it.
Can you share with us more about this language that you learned from the rivers?
The more I listened to rivers, the more I heard that the rivers, when it came to power, they seemed to speak about the flow of power, the way that there's something immanently powerful in our existence. In a human life, this might manifest as willpower, and the equivalent for a river is gravity. So the biological explanation for why rivers move from their mouth to their source, which is the ocean, is gravity. In a similar way, for human beings, even though we don't unfortunately always grasp that because we're not in the present and we're not listening, there's the force of willpower is something that really pushes us forward. Even just, getting out of bed in the morning is an act of willpower, if a smaller one in the scale of things. But willpower, it has a kind of goal attached to it. So when we have willpower, we often have a goal that we want to achieve. Whereas the flow and the sense of being and the sense of presence that I heard in rivers and how they move and how they exist on this planet was much more, imminent. It just was there. I further then wanted to understand power just as it is, rather than as something that is tied to a goal or tied to dominance and control, which is how your patriarchal knowledge has typically defined it. But even in feminist theory, power is often spoken about as power with. But that to me was also synonymous with ideas like solidarity and collaboration. And I really just wanted to know what power in its purest form potentially would look like. And so then I looked at the shape that rivers take, their journey, and what that said about power. And what it said was, or what came to me was how they start off at their mouth and then they branch. And, this is something that all rivers do. There's first like a stream, one singular stream, and then it branches off, meandering into several territories and meeting all kinds of obstacles, from deforestation to pollution to humans building dams and throwing rubbish in them, and all of these obstacles that rivers meet, yet they continue to flow. They flow above or beneath or on the side of the obstacles, but they continue moving in the direction that is their ultimate self-realization. And as they do that, they spread into these branching patterns. And so I call the language of exusions, the grammar of exusions, branching. And once I had sort of defined that, it was then interesting to look at branching in and how it manifests, in all variants of life, in like how trees branch, thunder branches, the human capillaries, our nerves in our brains, everything. It's really quite mesmerizing how many places you find this pattern, in the pistils of flowers, like in the tiniest of details in jellyfish, to if you take an aerial view of a mountain range, it follows this exact same branching pattern. Well, they're not fractal, so they're not exactly the same, but the fact that they branch out. And so that became the grammar of exusions. And within that grammar, to round it up, is a reciprocity. That's what is so beautiful in this grammar. It's that, it's a bit of the chicken and egg scenario where you can't really identify what came first. Was it the root or the branch? It's almost as if they're both giving birth to each other. Power, it's a little bit like that. It has a somewhat indefinable quality, but it is full of life. It is full of reciprocity. If we were to sort of apply exusions into our relationships, into our societies, we would bring in, like, how can we create governments that are centered on reciprocity, that see themselves as in this give and take relationship? How would that be something that we could all invest in and just have that kind of power that flows in of itself?
Hello. We're taking a short pause from the conversation. On behalf of our team and our community, thank you for being here and co-creating The Future is Beautiful. Much dedication, love, and time goes into the production of this show. We believe in being advertising free in a world that's always trying to sell us stuff we don't need. And so we make this show with you and for you, thanks to your support. There are 3 ways you can be more involved, so we can share the vision, wisdom, and creativity here as we explore what it means to be a human in this time. You can support the podcast by sharing it with your friends, posting episodes on social media, and doing iTunes reviews. You can support as a patron by making a monthly or one-off donation of your choice. And with this, you join the Global Patrons group and monthly video calls where we share connection and insight. You get to know the other amazing patrons from around the world, their stories and their work, and you offer direct support to me and the team, as well as being brought into the behind the scenes of creating something like this. It sounds like a lot, but it's as much or as little as you want to get involved in. You can become a member of Presence, our membership collective of care and practice, where we explore how to embody the themes of the podcast with workshops, calls, special events, tree whispers, and powerful tools, practices, and rituals that you can bring into your life. This is open to absolutely everybody as we create an inclusive and diverse space that celebrates well-being as a human right, where we explore together what it means to be creative, courageous, and connected to ourselves, each other, and the earth. This is about embodying sacred activism. We love meeting patrons and Presence members and how being part in this way weaves our lives together, as well as making this show possible. If anything from this conversation has moved or inspired you, please get more involved. All information can be found at www.thefutureisbeautiful.co/community. This show really can't go on without your patronage and Presence membership, so please do make it happen. And now, back to the conversation. From where we are now, and with what has been revealed and what is on the surface, some people will say this is the time that the old world, the old paradigm is dying. Perhaps that this is a time through which something different can emerge. How do you relate to this time that we're in?
Yes, I think a lot is happening. Probably premature to try to identify the patterns of what is happening. It feels to me sufficient to just be in the space that a lot is happening. Things are shifting without a doubt. There's just been so many things that have happened in a short space of time. I find it a little bit troubling is too strong of a term, but I'll just use it. It's a little bit troubling how very fast, already like in March, April, people were rushing to say that, oh, it means this and it means that, and we're now going to move toward this. And it felt indicative for me of how we might end up not shifting at all or going to our default mode times 100. Because if there's anything that these past few months have encouraged us to do, it is to take a step back and to listen. This is the golden opportunity if we're going to find any one positive thing about all of the horrific scenarios unfolding around the world. It is that we have to become better at listening. We have to take a step back and stop this knee-jerk reaction of wanting to identify and label and classify. At the same time, of course, it's in human nature to need to name things in order to do something. And so I'm not rejecting that very innate human necessity for survival, really. But there's a subtle quality of just being in that uncomfortable space where there isn't a direct answer right now, because there really isn't. As we speak, my hometown, Lagos, and actually the very neighborhood in which I live in Nigeria is under fire. We've had a kind of a massacre yesterday of protesters by the military. There's a war unfolding in Azerbaijan and Armenia. Thailand is up in flames. It's silly to even mention any specific ones because everywhere is burning. And then we simultaneously are moving essential parts of our lives into new formats and new realms. We're not seeing each other that much. We're becoming really virtual beings, which for all, even if we are gathering more and we're using technology quite positively in many ways, but there's inevitably a kind of robotization of our souls and our spirits that occurs when so many of our interactions are happening online, from, even the simplest things of buying medication that you might need, to seeing your GP, to the very meaningful relationships with communities that you belong to or loved ones. And so inevitably, it's doing something to the collective psyche. I'm really drawn to being in commune and to sharing space where there are less answers and more questions and more curiosities. I definitely think that it is a monumental shift for humankind that is taking place right now. And it's strange for people like both of us, like for you and for I, where, so much of the work that I've been doing for the past decade plus is about shift. It's about calling for a different kind of society, really, and social relations where we can exist in higher dimensions. Because when you belong to a group and to a lineage, such as we do as women, and as people of color, speak less of women of color, we belong to lineages that have been silenced kind of at best and then violated at worst. It's perhaps more obvious when you embody those qualities that a shift needs to happen, and that we're living on the kind of lowest dimension possible that humanity has the options to live within. And so it can seem a bit superfluous, is maybe not the right word, and neither is pretentious, but some kind of mix between those two words when suddenly everybody is speaking about shift, even those people who perhaps didn't care so much before. There's a tremendous beauty in that. And some days in the midst of all the concern and restlessness that I feel like we all feel in different ways, I find myself being quite awestruck by how beautiful it is that the world is suddenly receptive to these conversations that we've been trying to have on a wider scale for so long.
It felt poignant that as you were speaking, the sirens were going past, of that reminder of the fires that are burning, the panic, the fear and discomfort. And yeah, I love your reframing. I really resonate with the questions rather than the answers. For me, I'm very moved by those wisdom traditions that are holding prophecy at this time, that comes from a deeper place than just trying to understand what's going on. And then, of course, it's so natural to want to understand what's going on. For those of us that want our relating and our way of life to be with a different centering, of course, this is a time where we are hoping that this is that opportunity and wanting to understand how we can affect this being that time. And yet within all that, I hear the call to listen.
Yes, it's a tricky balance of possessing maybe years of introspection or content production or conversation that feels important and relevant to the time. And then also to saying, okay, this isn't about solutionism and, advocating that this is how we should do this, do X, Y, Z. Perhaps simpler than we often think, the ancient wisdom stories and our modern societies are complex in in so many layered ways with the technologies, everything that we've been talking about, are all the many layers of complexity of being in polarized societies. It's just so much. And I think there's a bit of a collective fatigue. And then when we think, oh, so on top of that, I'm going to add, the pursuit of ancient wisdom and trying to implement that. And how does that connect to living with integrity? It's so much. But sometimes I think we have to just recognize and have the awareness to not complicate things that could be simple. So, for example, I often think about what it would mean to live in a matriarchy, not because I would want a shift from patriarchy to matriarchy, but in order to develop my understanding as a feminist theorist who wants to see the ending of patriarchy, what would the contrasting society be? And patriarchy is really a rule of old men at large, but specifically old men. And so matriarchy would be the role of old women, of grandmothers. And the way that, if we think about whether it's our own grandparents or metaphorically about grandparents, grandfathers, as wonderful as they absolutely are, they can be quite distant. They play with you, but then they go into their study or whatever. Like, there's all kinds of archetypes and stereotypes we could reference here. But grandmothers take this huge presence in children's lives, and they're able to find the right ailment, whether it's in the shape of words or herbs or foods or whatever it might be. And that's the wisdom. That's the wisdom that is really missing in our society. And of course, you can go more in depth into that. And there's a lot of wonderful books about things like, the wisdom of nature and of intuition and things like that, which are qualities that I associate closely with the grandmotherly spirit. But there's also just a really simple way of, if we were to try to embody the grandmotherly spirit in our politics, in our care for each other. And also, because grandmotherly spirit is not only this loving, caring spirit, I think it's important to point out, and this is perhaps why we wouldn't want a matriarchy to replace a patriarchy, but grandmothers are very frank. The archetype is, they tell you as it is. There's no beating around the bush. But that's another quality that our society could really utilize. And it's no accident that there's no group that disappears from the public eye as much as older women, and often our grandmothers, whether or not they have children and grandchildren. But the crone, that energy is so absent from these mechanical, patriarchal, capitalist societies that we live in. Yes, part of asking those questions is channeling a little bit of that spirit and inviting older women to share more. I think that is, the very concrete thing that we can do if we are politically organizing culture in the cultural field. Whatever we do, maybe working a little bit extra hard to invite the voice and wisdom of older women.
If it's not a matriarchy, what is it that you feel from all of your research could be a holdings of a more beautiful future?
Ironically, it either doesn't exist or it just isn't coming to mind right now. But I don't know what the word is for, the mix of the two in terms of an archy. There's oligarchy, patriarchy, matriarchy. But what is it? Maybe that's something I'll explore in my writing, my questioning of things. But that is where I think from, that space, whatever that quality is that allows for the the wisdom of the grandmothers and the grandfathers, the youth and the elderly, the indigenous people and the city dwellers, to get to the truth of something, which I recognize that is what we have the opportunity to do right now. We're all asking so many questions. These are times that are more confusing than ever, not only because of the polarization and the political situations that are unfolding, but because of the misinformation and the very many agendas and the capital interests behind even our, most personal choices and relationships. The fact that we are befriending one another in spaces which are driven by profit making, it all lends to a crisis of clarity. And so everybody is asking so many questions and seeking clarity in different places, whether it is their favorite influencer or they're taking a course about this, that, or the other, or they're becoming invested in stoicism or, whatever it might be. It's like these mono pockets that can provide a sense of relief, a sense of clarity is what people are seeking. And yet the truth, or rather a truth, because there are many truths in this planet, for looking at something, whether it's a question or a situation or an object, from as many perspectives and angles as possible. Really, in our clarity-seeking endeavors, we would do well to be asking the questions that preoccupy our minds from as many lenses as we possibly can. And in my worldview, that is what is occurring subconsciously. And also when I do think about topics intentionally, I kind of automatically, I'm drawn to looking at them multi-perspectively. Yeah, it's even obvious when you look at an object, if you, let's just say a rock, a stone, if you look at it from the left, it's going to have one shape. If you stand above it, it will have another shape. And similarly, if you look at it from under the object, it's again different. It might even have a different color or candor to it. And so if we just think about how that applies to something as simple as a stone, it helps to fathom how incredibly important it is for something as how do we deal with a pandemic, or how do we deal with all of the many issues that have arisen in recent times. I think we all in the 21st century are born almost by default into this kind of multi-perspectival approach of looking at things, but we still have a long way to go. And I guess I noticed this especially because in my own life, I guess I've never really had the opportunity to not think about things from many angles. I'm Finnish and grew up in Nigeria, then moved to Sweden and then to the US via Spain. And now I live in the UK. I come from an interfaith family. My parents met in Germany, so they speak German to each other. And my mother and I spoke Finnish. My father and I spoke English. There's so many layers to my identity that inform whatever it is that I think about and I become curious about. I kind of automatically think about it in a different language, or what I know from Islam, which my dad's Muslim, or from my deciding to become a Catholic when I was a child, but then eventually shunning all religion. And I'm not saying that you have to be, mixed ethnicity or speak many languages to be able to grasp this very essential and urgent quality of multidimensionality. But because I really do believe that we're almost by default have to do that in this time where globalization and the way that we get news, not only about where we live, but basically what happens in one part of the world really impacts the rest of the world. So wherever we are, we're being shaped by incidents that are happening in regions vastly different and far away from ours. But I do still notice, I guess because of my many identities, my multiple identities, I do still notice that there are angles that are clear to me, but that are really ungraspable to many others quite frequently in conversations that I partake in. We need to more intentionally develop, and tying it back to the motivation here is so that we can feel that we have more clarity and that we are seeing the truth of a matter more clearly, because ultimately, the more we do that, the less inclined we will be to destroy and judge and just create ugliness in the world.
I relate to that so fully, that if we want to be able to embrace a perspective in which everyone is allowed to be present, and not just everyone, but the more than human as well, Earth as a living being, our ancestors and our future generations, as well as the humans that are here, we have to expand our capacity for that multi-dimensionality and our shifting of identities, our fluidity. I guess it comes back to the river, right? Like, to being able to flow with our perspectives. I know that for having parents of different religions, and then having India as a cultural background and being brought up in the UK, that's given me a certain kind of perspective. And then you get another perspective from the exact region in which you grow up, or the kind of school that you go to, or whatever it is along the way. We all do have access to those perspectives. It's not always as defining as, the house that you grew up in, where with very clear different identities and languages. But this is a time where we're being invited to understand those different perspectives as parts of ourselves, as we live in a time where not only do we understand the interbeing, and we understand the way that we're affected by what's happening in places far away, but also where there are not many places on earth where the only people that you will find in that place are of that place, from an ancestral 7 generations kind of background. We're living at a time where there has been such vast amounts of migration, and with the climate crisis and the refugee crisis, as well as the fires, and by the fires I mean the forest fires, but the wars, the brutality, that we are being asked to redefine our understanding of borders, and those borders of perspective, and our own identity, to expand that identity out into a bigger state of what being a human means.
We have to understand that this is quite exciting in its own way, because a big part of the problem is that, even though people are exposed to so many varied perspectives, identities, stories from around the world, the news, both good and bad, the catastrophes in the news, and, everybody now knows that our planet is collapsing right before our eyes, even though many are in denial about it. But the problem is not so much that people are not able to identify that they have quite literally at their fingertips the access to different worldviews and perspectives, that they rank them. And this is why I always want to go back to this, the core of the issue being this fragmenting way of thinking that furthermore is rooted in creating ranking and measuring. There are people who spend years, maybe lifetimes, dedicated to researching a different part of the world and where they're from, or studying a new language, or traveling around the world, and yet are incredibly narrow-minded. And that is why it's not per se that you come from many different backgrounds or you speak many languages. It's that you speak the language of curiosity and of humanitarianism. It's not a fashionable concept. I think it's really central to this conversation in that it is the quality that changes how you approach the fluidity of multidimensionality that exists inevitably around us right now. In the case of the mindset, which can be narrow-minded despite exposure to so many different cultures, the thing that really prevents that mindset from expanding and flowing into a higher dimension is that it is reluctant to undo the notion and understanding of itself as superior. And in some cases, the notion of itself as inferior, because the two are flip sides of the same coin in a sense, as the inferiority complex is the shadow of a superiority complex. And it's so ironic because stepping into a multi-perspectival worldview and starting to see the world more clearly as a consequence of that is exciting. In fact, it's maybe the thing that can bring and restore a sense of joy in these really troubling times. The fact that we have this opportunity to really learn from each other and learn from nature and listen to what it's trying to say to us. So yes, it strikes me that it's that question of how do you start to see people, to see social issues afresh without all of your prejudgments and this idea that, oh, I can do what they're doing better. I have a better solution. I have the technology or the scientific knowledge that is better than whatever this community is using. And instead say, look, I have this thing. I'll tell you about it. I'll tell you what it has meant in my society, in my culture. And you tell me about what you do. And let's just share and see if some kind of marriage between the two occurs of its own accord. And in those fortunate instances where an amalgamation does happen and you suddenly are exposed to some bigger truth, it's so life affirming to be able to almost feel your own mind expanding and how that is going to affect every part of your life in subtle and discreet ways sometimes, but certainly in some way.
It's a powerful invitation, the most potent invitation of this time. And often our identities can give us the doorway into that inquiry.
Yeah, it's the purpose behind identity to give us a doorway into inquiry, as you beautifully put it. If there were a God, to be a bit poetic and evoke my inner storyteller here, but if there were a God and they created, human beings in all of our diversity, what other point would there be to that than for that to be an asset to us, collectively speaking? The fact that we seem to have missed that, so colossally, except for in beautiful and, luckily we have pockets of community where that does happen around the world. But when you consider that there's no nation, there's no country on this planet where that is a kind of guiding principle to utilize different ways of being, which is what identity in many ways is, as an asset, is such a missed opportunity to evolve and to sort of see what the human species is capable of and what kinds of conversations we can have together. And it's always fascinating to me how when we do that, even if we do it in a promille, a tiny iota of a scale, it always brings us back to nature, because that is how nature operates. It can't help but to evoke and draw metaphor and observe just these patterns between the cosmic and the particular. the more we can enter that frame of mind, the more it will become more automatic to us to protect Earth. And ultimately that is what will save our planet, will be when larger groups start to just automatically feel that they are in communion with the natural world, and that they are learning from it and in relationship with it in a reciprocal kind of way. Because it's quite difficult to just follow a formula where you understand, like your rational brain understands that something has to be done, and there's a formulaic way of doing it, and it's much better than not doing it at all. So I'm certainly not critical of that. But the ultimate kind of flow that we need to save the planet is when it just becomes a part of our language, a part of our identity and our exchange of identities being used in that way in which they are assets. This strikes me as incredibly urgent, that we focus on knowing, on shifting the ways that we know, and that we start to open up to listening and to not placing judgment on our own identity contra another's. And it might seem sometimes that like those doing that kind of work is not directly addressing any specific forest deforestation or in a specific region, or looking at a particular conflict in some region in the world. And while all of that has to happen, there needs to be a parallel call to look at these deeper and more maybe existentialist approaches, because they are the ones that are going to have the more lasting impact. And one thing that we certainly know 100%, if we care to look at human history, is that short-term solutions don't ever fix anything. In fact, they add to the problem. And so the level of information that we have now, thanks to the internet, among other things, we really have no excuses anymore to not be single issue minded. We are now a species who are able to be complex, and where we struggle with that, it is our job at this time. And maybe this is another way, or a concise way, of responding to your earlier question about what is shifting in this time. And so it is our job to become, to be, to allow, to encourage, to promote, to listen to see complexity, and to really think about complexity and how that can manifest for us personally, for the kinds of structures that we want to see erupt and become, and for the way in which our relationships with ourselves and each other and the natural world can emerge.
Thank you. It has been an absolute pleasure to speak with you and to hear this perspective, to feel this perspective, and what's possible if more of us are to understand and to embody sensuous knowledge.
Thank you. It's been really great to speak with you, Amisha, and thank you for this platform that you've put together, and that is helping us to facilitate these conversations that are so nourishing and needed right now.
Thank you. And with that, I want to also offer gratitude to your dedication with your blog, and to be in that space of inquiry with such dedication and longevity, so that these perspectives that are not the current dominant way of viewing the world find their ways to us, and through them we are transformed.
Thank you.
Can you share how you would like us to connect with you further?
Yes, you can find me on social media with the handle at MsAfropolitan, or on my website, which is www.MsAfropolitan.com. And I have a contact form there as well if you want to reach out. I'm on all of the social media platforms as well.
Excellent. And everyone can go and read your book, Sensuous Knowledge.
Yes, I've linked to it on the website, so you can find ways to purchase it from there, but it is available in most independent bookstores.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for spending your precious time with us. As always, you can find links to everything we mention in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on the blog. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible with you, our community. If you loved this and would like to fund our show with a monthly donation or join our online group to connect with other listeners, please visit www.thefutureisbeautiful.co and click on Community and Support. Please also share with friends, hit subscribe, and leave us a review so we can grow. Those gold stars really help others find us, so these ideas can spread. Here is to us, creating a beautiful future together. The Future is Beautiful is made by an all-female team working voluntarily or on reduced rates until our listener support grows. If you have been moved by anything you heard here, please donate the equivalent of buying us a drink. All donations make a huge difference to us and will allow us to keep doing this and remain advertising free. Until next time, I leave you with this question. How will you create beauty in the world?